In 479 BC, a Persian king threw a 7-day party to forget his military defeat. Drunk on wine and power, he made a promise he couldn't take back. What happened next didn't just destroy one life, it shattered his entire family. And the worst part, he chose it. Before we dive into this tragic story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel uncovers the darkest, most shocking truths from history that they never taught you in school. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. In the autumn of 480 BC, King Xerxes I of Persia watched his fleet burn at Salamis. The Greek triremes had shattered his naval power in a single day of chaos and fire. 1 year later, at Plataea, his ground forces met the same fate. The Greeks, a collection of fractured city-states that should have been easy prey, had humiliated the largest empire the world had ever seen. But Xerxes did not return to Persia as a defeated man. He returned as a god-king who refused to acknowledge failure. By 479 BC, Xerxes ruled an empire that stretched from the shores of Libya in the west to the Indus River Valley in the east, from the mountains of Thrace in the north to the deserts of Ethiopia in the south. Historians estimate his empire controlled approximately 50 million people, nearly half the world's population at that time. 20 different nations, dozens of languages, countless cultures, all bound together under one throne. His throne, the Persian administrative system, was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. Xerxes governed through 20 satrapies, massive provinces, each ruled by a hand-picked governor who answered only to him. Royal roads connected the empire, allowing messengers to travel from Sardis to Susa in just 7 days, a journey that would take ordinary travelers 3 months. His word could reach the edges of the known world faster than any king before him. But speed of communication meant something far more significant: speed of control. In the Achaemenid Persian system, the great king was not simply a political leader, he was the embodiment of divine order itself. Ancient Persian inscriptions describe Xerxes as the king of kings, king of lands, king of many peoples. His authority was absolute in ways that are difficult for modern minds to grasp. There was no constitution, no senate, no council that could overrule him. Persian law was explicit. The word of the great king was law the moment he spoke it. To question his judgment was not political disagreement, it was heresy against the cosmic order. This extended into every corner of Persian life. But nowhere was it more absolute than within the royal family itself. The royal harem at Persepolis was not simply a residence, it was a political institution. Persian princesses and royal women lived under a protocol so rigid that every aspect of their lives, who they could speak to, where they could go, when they could eat, was controlled by imperial decree. Women of the royal bloodline were considered assets of the empire. Their bodies, their futures, their children, all of it belonged to the state, or more accurately, to the king. Marriages were arranged, not for love or even happiness, but for political consolidation. A daughter of the great king could be given in marriage to secure an alliance, reward a loyal general, or bind a powerful family to the throne. The women had no say in these decisions. Their consent was never asked for, because in the Persian understanding of power, their will was irrelevant. Xerxes had multiple wives and many children. Among them was a young daughter, barely into adolescence, favored by her father for reasons the sources hint at but never fully explain. Perhaps her beauty, perhaps her resemblance to someone he had loved, perhaps simply because she reminded him of a time before Greece, before Salamis, before the weight of his failures became too heavy to ignore. But absolute power does not protect the people who live under it. Sometimes it destroys them, and Xerxes was about to prove this in the most brutal way imaginable, not through war or conquest, but through a single drunken decision at a banquet that would last 7 days. In the summer of 479 BC, Xerxes ordered a celebration. The palace at Persepolis, built by his father Darius and expanded during his own reign, became the stage for a banquet that would last 7 days and 7 nights. The official reason was clear: to reassert Persian power and wealth after the setbacks in Greece, to remind the empire's elite that Persia remained the greatest civilization on earth. The gardens of the royal palace were transformed into a spectacle of imperial excess. Thousands of guests filled the columned halls. Satraps from distant provinces, military commanders, nobles from Babylon and Egypt, priests of Ahura Mazda, merchants who had grown rich on the Silk Road. The decorations alone told the story of conquest. Tapestries from Babylon, gold vessels from Lydia, carpets from Bactria, incense from Arabia. Wine flowed not from servants' cups but from artificial fountains designed by Persian engineers. Musicians played instruments from every corner of the empire. Dancers moved between the massive stone columns carved with images of subject peoples, bringing tribute to the throne. It was a display designed to intoxicate, and Xerxes, more than anyone, was drunk on it. Among those present at the banquet was the king's younger daughter. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing just one generation after these events and relying on Persian sources who had fled to Greece, identifies her as a She was 14 years old. Ancient sources describe her as exceptionally beautiful, even by the standards of the Persian court, where beauty was cultivated as an art form. More importantly, she was known to be her father's favorite. While other daughters had been sent away to distant satrapies for political marriages, this daughter had been kept close. Xerxes displayed affection toward her that was unusual for a Persian king, who was expected to remain emotionally distant from all family members to preserve the image of divine detachment. On the third day of the banquet, something happened that would destroy her life. Xerxes, after days of continuous drinking and surrounded by courtiers who reinforced every impulse, made a public declaration. He announced that he would grant any request to any guest who asked, any request at all. He sealed this promise with an oath before the assembled nobles, invoking the Persian gods as witnesses. In Persian culture, an oath made publicly before witnesses and before the gods was binding. To break it would be to admit fallibility, and for a great king who claimed to embody cosmic order itself, fallibility was impossible. It was a catastrophic mistake. Among the guests was Artabanus, a general who had served both Xerxes and his father Darius before him. He was over 60 years old, a veteran of decades of imperial campaigns. He had lost 3 previous wives and had been calculating for years how to secure his position at court. Through a direct marriage alliance with the royal family, ancient sources describe him as ambitious and politically shrewd, a man who understood how power worked and how to exploit moments of weakness. When Xerxes made his public oath, Artabanus saw his opportunity. He stood before the king, in front of thousands of witnesses, and made his request. He asked for the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. The banquet hall fell silent. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Everyone present understood the audacity of what had just happened. Persian princesses of direct royal blood rarely married subjects. When they did, it was 2 young princes of noble Persian families, carefully chosen alliances that strengthened the dynasty. They did not marry aging generals, no matter how decorated or loyal. But Xerxes had made an oath, in public, before the gods, with thousands of witnesses. Ancient accounts describe the king's reaction. He went pale, his hands gripped the arms of his throne. He looked around the hall as if searching for escape. For several long minutes, he said nothing. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. His daughter was present. She watched her father struggle with a choice that should not have been a choice at all. On one side was his love for his daughter. On the other was his image, the image of a king whose word was absolute, who never made mistakes, whose authority could not be questioned or revised. Xerxes chose the image. He spoke a single word. Granted, Amestris had just witnessed her own life being sold to preserve her father's pride. Later sources, fragmented and preserved in Greek texts that drew from Persian oral traditions, suggest that she tried to reach him afterward, that she went to him privately, away from the public eye, and begged him to find a way to reverse the decision, to admit the oath had been made in error. To protect her, Xerxes never responded. He had made his choice, and a great king did not revisit his choices. To do so would be to admit he had been wrong, and gods do not make mistakes. The marriage was set. The political logic was clear. Artabanus would be bound to the royal family, his loyalty secured through blood. It was, Xerxes likely told himself, a prudent decision. The stability of the empire required such sacrifices, but it was his daughter who would pay the price. 3 months after that banquet, the wedding was held with all the ceremony appropriate for a princess of the Achaemenid dynasty. The rituals were performed correctly. The proper sacrifices were made. Silk robes and jewels worth more than entire cities were displayed. But witnesses who recorded their observations described the event as a spectacle of disguised sadness. Amestris, dressed in imperial finery, moved through the ceremony like someone already dead. Artabanus, by contrast, displayed undisguised satisfaction. He had secured what few men in the empire could ever dream of, a permanent blood connection to the royal line. The age difference was stark. Amestris was 14, Artabanus was over 60. In a culture where such disparities were not uncommon, this one still caused discomfort. The whispers in the palace corridors were not about legality or custom, they were about cruelty.
What
followed was worse than anyone had anticipated. Artabanus took his new wife to his private quarters within the palace complex and immediately imposed total isolation. Persian sources that later made their way to Greek historians describe how he forbade Amestris from visiting her family's residential areas. She was not permitted to see her mother. She was not allowed to communicate with her sisters. This separation was particularly devastating in Persian court culture, where women of the royal family relied on each other for emotional support and social identity. In a world that gave them almost no other power, Artabanus assigned his own loyal servants to watch her constantly. She had no freedom of movement, no autonomy. Ancient accounts describe her existence in those quarters as imprisonment in everything but name, but the isolation was only the beginning. Artabanus had not married Amestris for companionship or even for political prestige alone. He wanted an heir, a son who carried royal Achaemenid blood, a child who would cement his family's position in the imperial hierarchy forever. Sources describe his obsession in language that, even by the modest standards of ancient texts, makes clear the horror of what this meant. Despite his advanced age, Artabanus subjected Amestris to repeated conjugal demands. He was not interested in her as a person. He treated her as a means to an end, a vessel through which his lineage could be elevated. Administrative records from Persepolis, preserved on clay tablets, show payments to court physicians and purchases of herbs and substances believed to increase fertility. Medical specialists were consulted, rituals were performed. Amestris was not a wife, she was a reproductive project. 3 years into the marriage, in 476 BC, she became pregnant. Artabanus reacted with public celebration. He ordered feasts, made lavish offerings to the Persian gods, and announced to the court that his heir was coming. For him, it was triumph. For Amestris, it was the final seal on her cage. She understood what the pregnancy meant. If she produced a son with royal blood, she would never escape this marriage. Mothers of imperial heirs were never permitted to divorce or leave. The child would bind her to Artabanus permanently. Ancient sources describe her state during the pregnancy as one of deep melancholy. Servants reported that she would spend hours staring out the windows of her quarters toward the palace gardens where she had once danced before her marriage. She often refused food and had to be forced to eat by attendants alarmed for her health. In the 9th month, she went into labor. It lasted 2 days. Court midwives documented the complications in records that have survived in fragmentary form. The child that was finally born was a boy. Artabanus immediately named him Xerxes, after the grandfather whose blood he carried, but the infant was weak and sickly. Palace physicians expressed concerns about his survival from the moment of birth. Artabanus, consumed by ambition, ignored the warnings and began planning elaborate presentation ceremonies to introduce the child to the court. Those ceremonies never happened. 10 days after birth, the baby died. Medical records attribute the death to respiratory failure, a common cause of infant mortality in the ancient world. But rumors spread through the palace almost immediately. Some courtiers whispered that Amestris, in desperation, had suffocated her own child to free herself from the marriage. Others claimed that servants loyal to the princess, horrified by her suffering, had deliberately neglected the infant. No evidence exists to confirm either theory, but the fact that such rumors circulated at all reveals how the court perceived the marriage, as so cruel that even infanticide would be understandable as an act of escape. The death of the child transformed Artabanus. Consumed by suspicion that Amestris had somehow caused it, he became violent. Multiple sources describe shouting coming from his quarters. Servants observed Amestris with visible bruises on her face and arms. In one documented incident, Artabanus beat her so severely that she was bedridden for weeks. When she finally recovered physically, something inside her had broken. Servants described a profound change. The young woman who had once tried to plead with her father, who had attempted small acts of resistance, now existed in a state of complete apathy. She moved through her days like a ghost. She spoke rarely. She ate only when forced. She would sit for hours, motionless, staring at nothing. Her eyes, witnesses said, looked empty, as if the person who had once lived behind them had already left. Reports of his daughter's condition eventually reached Xerxes. Servants spoke carefully, but the truth was impossible to hide. Amestris was deteriorating. The bruises, the silence, the empty stare. For perhaps the first time since that banquet, Xerxes was forced to confront what his decision had actually cost. He attempted to intervene. Ancient sources indicate that he summoned Artabanus and ordered him to treat Amestris with more consideration. It was a pathetically weak gesture from a man who claimed absolute power. But it was something Artabanus responded with, a reminder that destroyed any moral ground Xerxes might have claimed. He pointed out, with perfect logic, that the king himself had consented to this marriage, that Persian law gave a husband authority over his wife, that the treatment of his spouse was the husband's prerogative. He did not need to say the rest aloud, that if Xerxes now questioned the marriage, he would be admitting the original decision had been wrong, and a great king could not be wrong. Xerxes was trapped in a prison of his own construction. To save his daughter now would require him to acknowledge that his pride had been more important to him than her life, that his image of infallibility had mattered more than her suffering, that he had sacrificed her for nothing. He could not do it, so he retreated, and Amestris remained exactly where she was. The bitter irony of what came next is almost too perfect to be coincidence. In 465 BC, 14 years after Amestris's marriage, Artabanus led a conspiracy that murdered Xerxes in his own palace. The assassination was the result of complex political factionalism and succession disputes that had been building for years. But according to some accounts preserved by Greek historians, Artabanus used a specific justification when rallying support for the coup. He argued that Xerxes had become a weak and morally corrupt tyrant. As evidence, he pointed to the king's willingness to sacrifice his own daughter, to condemn her to a marriage that destroyed her simply to avoid admitting a mistake. He used Amestris's suffering, the suffering he himself had inflicted, as proof that Xerxes was unfit to rule. It was a perverse masterpiece of manipulation. The man who had brutalized a young woman for 14 years now claimed moral outrage at the father, who had allowed it to happen. Artabanus controlled the palace for 7 months, but the coup ultimately failed. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, gathered loyal forces and launched a counterattack. The fighting reached inside Persepolis itself. Artabanus was cornered by the royal guard and killed in violent combat within the palace walls. He had murdered his father-in-law. He had used his wife's suffering as propaganda, and in the end, he died by the sword, his ambitions collapsing as completely as the life he had destroyed. But for his death came far too late. When Artabanus was executed in 465 BC, Amestris was finally free. She was 28 years old. She had survived 14 years of a marriage that had systematically destroyed everything she had been. Freedom should have been a moment of relief, of possibility, but the sources make clear that Amestris was beyond the reach of relief. Witnesses who saw her after Artabanus's death described a woman who looked decades older than her years. Her hair had turned prematurely gray. Her face, once praised throughout the Persian court for its beauty, was drawn and aged, but it was her expression that disturbed people most. Courtiers described it as vacant, absent, as if she were looking at the world from somewhere very far away. Her half-brother, now King Artaxerxes I, attempted to restore her to a place of honor in the court. He offered her comfortable quarters. He gave her freedom to move through the palace. He invited her to banquets and ceremonies, trying to reintegrate her into the life she had been torn from 14 years earlier. She refused almost everything. She rarely left her rooms. She spoke so infrequently that servants would go weeks without hearing her voice. When she did appear in public spaces, she would sit in silence, staring at nothing, her presence more unsettling than her absence. Then came a moment that revealed just how deep the trauma went. On one occasion, Artaxerxes sent musicians to her quarters, hoping that music might bring her some comfort. The musicians began to play, working through their repertoire. Then one of them began a melody that had been popular at court celebrations years before. It was a song that had been played at that Saturday banquet in 479 BC, the banquet where a 14-year-old girl had danced before her father made a promise that destroyed her. Amestris screamed. It was the first time in years that anyone had heard her raise her voice. She lunged at the musicians and smashed their instruments. Then she collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, in a way that frightened everyone present. The episode lasted until she was physically exhausted. After that, no one tried to bring her music again. In 457 BC, Amestris died. She was 36 years old. Ancient sources describe the cause vaguely as a prolonged illness, a common euphemism in historical texts that often concealed more than it revealed. Modern medical historians, analyzing the descriptions of her final years, have suggested several possibilities. One is that she slowly starved herself by refusing food, a form of suicide that allowed the victim to maintain some dignity and exercise final control over their own fate. Another interpretation is severe clinical depression that led to physical deterioration, a recognized phenomenon where psychological trauma manifests as terminal physical decline. Whatever the immediate medical cause, contemporaries understood the deeper truth. Amestris had not died in 457 BC, she had died in 479 BC. At that banquet, the moment her father chose his pride over her life, the body that stopped functioning in 457 was simply the last remnant of a person who had been destroyed almost 2 decades earlier. The official Persian records never mention her. The inscriptions at Persepolis that catalogue Xerxes' achievements, his buildings, his campaigns, his power say nothing about the daughter he sacrificed. She was erased from the imperial narrative as thoroughly as she had been erased from life. Only in Greek sources, particularly Herodotus and later chroniclers who preserved Persian oral traditions, do fragments of her story survive. And even there, she appears mostly as a footnote, an example of Persian excess, a cautionary tale about tyranny, not recognized fully as an individual tragedy of a young woman destroyed by her father's absolute power and an old man's ambition. But the fragments are enough. They tell us that Amestris existed, that she suffered, and that her suffering mattered. Even if her own civilization chose to forget her, Xerxes is remembered for his wars, his monuments, his empire. Official Persian records never mention Amestris. Only Greek sources preserved fragments of her story, a footnote in history about tyranny, not recognized as the individual tragedy it was, but her story reveals a form of violence that transcends time, the sacrifice of children for ego, image, or power. Xerxes commanded 50 million people and built monuments that lasted millennia, but when that absolute power turned inward, toward his own daughter, without compassion or accountability, it became an instrument of destruction. This is the tragedy of absolute power, when one person's whim can destroy lives with no possibility of justice. Xerxes could have saved her at any point. What he lacked wasn't power, it was the ability to admit he was wrong. How many people today remain trapped by decisions made by those who refuse to admit mistakes? The greatest horrors don't always happen on battlefields. Sometimes they happen at family banquets, made by fathers too proud to say, "I was wrong." If this story impacted you, subscribe for more untold histories. Comment, what historical figure should we investigate next? Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because remembering is how we honor those history tried to forget.